Hi, we are reading Hell is the Absence of God by Ted Chiang from Stories of Your Life. This is the story of a man named Neil Fisk and how he came to love God. The pivotal event in Neil's life was an occurrence both terrible and ordinary, the death of his wife Sarah. Neil was consumed with grief after she died, a grief that was excruciating not only because of its intrinsic magnitude but because it also renewed and emphasized the previous pains of his life. Her death forced him to re examine his relationship with God, and in doing so, he began a journey that would change him forever. Neil was born with a congenital abnormality that caused his left thigh to be externally rotated and several inches shorter than his right. The medical term for it was proximal femoral focus deficiency. Most people he met assumed God was responsible for this, but Neil's mother hadn't witnessed any visitations while carrying him. His condition was a result of improper limb development during the sixth week of gestation, nothing more. In fact, as far as Neil's mother was concerned, blame rested with his absent father, whose income might have made corrective surgery a possibility, although she never expressed this sentiment aloud. As a child, Neil had occasionally wondered if he was being punished by God, but most of the time he blamed his classmates in school for his unhappiness. The nonchalant cruelty, their instinctive ability to locate the weakness in a victim's emotional armor, the way their own friendships were reinforced by their sadism, he recognized these as examples of human behavior, not divine. And although his classmates often used God's name in their taunts, Neil knew better than to blame him for their actions. But while Neil avoided the pitfall of blaming God, he never made the jump to loving him. Nothing in his upbringing or his personality led him to pray to God for strength or for relief. The assorted trials he faced growing up were accidental or human in origin, and he relied on strictly human resources to counter them. He became an adult who, like many others, viewed God's actions in the abstract until they impinged upon his own life. Angelic visitations were events that befell other people, reaching him only via reports on the nightly news. His own life was entirely mundane. He worked as a superintendent for an upscale apartment building, collecting rent and performing repairs, and as far as he was concerned, circumstances were fully capable of unfolding, happily or not, without intervention from above. This remained his experience until the death of his wife. It was an exceptional visitation, smaller in magnitude than most, but no different in kind, bringing blessings to some and disaster to others. In this instance, the angel was Nathaniel, Nathaniel making an appearance in a downtown shopping district. Four miracle cures were effected: the elimination of carcinomas in two individuals, the regeneration of the spinal cord in a paraplegic, and the restoration of sight to a recently blinded person. There were also two miracles that were not cures. A delivery van whose driver had fainted at the side of the angel was halted before he could overrun a busy sidewalk. Another man was caught in a shaft of heaven's light when the angel departed, erasing his eyes but ensuring his devotion. Neil's wife Sarah Fisk had been one of the eight casualties. She was hit by flying glass when the angel's billowing curtain of flame shattered the storefront window of the cafe in which she was eating. She bled to death within minutes, and the other customers in the cafe, none of whom suffered even superficial injuries, could do nothing but listen to her cries of pain and fear and eventually witness her soul's ascension towards heaven. Nathaniel hadn't delivered any specific message. The angel's parting words, which had boomed out across the entire visitation state, were the typical "Behold the power of the Lord." Of the eight casualties that day, three souls were accepted into heaven and five were not, a closer ratio than the average of death by all causes. 62 people received medical treatment for injuries ranging from slight concussions to ruptured eardrums to burns requiring skin grafts. Total property damage was estimated at $8.1 million, all of it excluded by private insurance companies due to the cost. Scores of people became devout worshippers in the wake of the visitation, neither out of gratitude or terror. Alas, Neil Frisk was not one of them. After a visitation, it's common for all the witnesses to meet as a group and discuss how their common experience has affected their lives. The witnesses of Nathaniel's latest visitation arranged as group meetings, and family members of those who had died were welcome, so Neil began attending. The meetings were held once a month in a basement room of a large church downtown. There were metal folding chairs arranged in rows, and in the back of the room was a table holding coffee and donuts. Everyone wore adhesive name tags made out in felt tip pen. While waiting for the meetings to start, people would stand around drinking coffee, talking casually. Most people Neil spoke to assumed his leg was a result of the visitation, and he had to explain that he wasn't a witness, but rather the husband of one of the casualties. This did not bother him particularly. He was used to explaining about his leg. What did bother him was the tone of the meetings themselves. When participants spoke about their reaction to the visitation, most of them talked about their newfound devotion to God, and they tried to persuade the bereaved that they should feel the same. Neil's reaction to such attempts at persuasion depended on who was making it. When it was an ordinary witness, he found it merely irritating. When someone who had received a miracle cure told him to love God, he had to restrain an impulse to strangle the person. But what he found most disquieting of all was hearing the same suggestion from a man named Tony Crane. Tony's wife had died in the visitation too, and he now projected an air of groveling with his every movement. In hushed, tearful tones, he explained how he had accepted his role as one of God's subjects, and he advised Neil to do likewise. Neil didn't stop attending the meetings. He felt that he somehow owed it to Sarah to stick with them. But he found another group to go as well, one more compatible with his own feelings. A support group devoted to those who'd lost a loved one during a visitation and were angry at God because of it. They met every other week in a room at the local community center and talked about the grief and rage that boiled inside of them. All the attendees were generally sympathetic to one another, despite differences in their various attitudes towards God. Of those who had been devout before their loss, some struggled with the task of remaining so, while others gave up their devotion without a second glance. Of those who'd never been devout, some felt their position had been validated, while others were faced with the near impossible task of becoming devout now. Neil found himself, to his consternation, in this last category. Like every other non devout person, Neil had never expended much energy on where his soul would end up. He'd always assumed his destination was hell, and he accepted that. That was the way of things, and hell, after all, was not physically worse than the mortal plane. It meant permanent exile from God, no more and no less. The truth of this was plain for anyone to see on those occasions when hell manifested itself. These happen on a regular basis. The ground seemed to become transparent, and you could see hell as if you were walking through a hole in the floor. The lost souls looked no different than the living, their eternal bodies resembling mortal ones. You couldn't communicate with them. Their exile from God meant that they couldn't apprehend the mortal plane where his actions were still felt. But as long as the manifestation lasted, you could hear them talk, laugh, or cry just as they had when they were alive. People varied widely in their reactions to these manifestations. Most devout people were galvanized not by the sight of anything frightening, but as being reminded that eternity outside paradise was a possibility. Neil, by contrast, was one of those who were unmoved. As far as he could tell, the lost souls as a group were no unhappier than he was. Their existence was no worse than his in the mortal plane, and in some ways better. His eternal body would be unhampered by congenital abnormalities. Of course, everyone knew that heaven was incomparably superior, but to Neil it had always seemed too remote to consider, like wealth of fame or glamour. For people like him, hell was where you went when you died, and he saw no point in restructuring his life in hopes of avoiding that. And since God hadn't previously played a role in Neil's life, he wasn't afraid of being exiled from God. The prospect of living without interference, living in a world where windfalls and misfortunes were never by design, held no terror for him. Now that Sarah was in heaven, his situation had changed. Neil wanted more than anything to be reunited with her, and the only way to get to heaven was to love God with all his heart. This is Neil's story, but telling it properly requires the telling of two other individuals whose paths became entwined with his. The first of these is Janice Riley. I'll stop it here and read it offline.